By 2008 in Helmand Province, coalition special operations forces had already mastered the night. Raids were fast, precise, and repeatable. Helicopters in low, teams on target within seconds, compounds cleared in minutes, and prisoners extracted before the area could react. For a time, it worked exactly as intended, but the Taliban adapted. Fighters stopped staying in compounds after dusk, weapons were moved before dark, and key figures avoided predictable locations entirely. Raids continued every night, but more often they were hitting empty buildings or low-level individuals. The system itself wasn't failing, it was being anticipated. Intelligence lagged just enough behind movement to make each operation slightly late, and over time that delay became a pattern. During the day, meanwhile, coalition patrols were still taking steady losses from IEDs and ambushes, especially in dense agricultural zones where visibility was limited and movement was restricted. The Taliban didn't need to win outright, they only needed to stay one step ahead and keep the pressure constant. When a British SAS squadron rotated into theatre, they entered without fanfare. No shift in command, no change in official planning, just another Allied unit integrating into an already established system. On paper, they were there to support operations. In practice, they viewed the situation differently. Many had experience from Iraq and Northern Ireland, where predictable tactics were quickly exploited. What they saw in Helmand wasn't a lack of capability, but a pattern the enemy had learned to work around. Night operations still worked, but they were expected. And once something becomes expected, it loses its advantage. The issue wasn't whether to keep using the night, but whether relying on it too heavily had made coalition forces predictable. The point surfaced during a joint planning session with American Special Operations. The target was a Taliban facilitator tracked through signals intelligence and local reporting. Pattern of life showed he used a compound overnight, making it a standard night raid objective. The plan followed a familiar structure. Insert after midnight, isolate the compound, breach, detain, extract. It was efficient and based on proven methods. The SAS team leader didn't dismiss it, but he reframed the question. Instead of focusing on how to hit the target, he asked when the target felt least threatened. If movement was expected at night, then night no longer provided surprise. The suggestion was simple but risky. Operate during daylight, when behavior was more routine and less defensive. There was hesitation, and it was justified. Daylight in Helmand meant exposure. Movement could be observed over long distances, especially in flat terrain. Civilian presence complicated identification and increased the chance of escalation. A failed approach could alert the entire area within minutes. Still, the idea wasn't rejected. A limited operation was approved under controlled conditions. A smaller team, a contained target, ground movement to reduce signature, and a clear point to disengage if the situation changed. It wasn't a shift in doctrine, just a test. The movement began late morning, when activity was steady but not crowded. Vehicles followed normal routes at controlled speeds, avoiding anything that would stand out. That didn't make them invisible, but it reduced immediate suspicion. Helmand was full of informal observation networks. Most things were noticed, but not everything triggered action. The goal was to move without drawing focused attention too early. As the convoy approached the target area, the pace slowed. Dismount was deliberate, balancing exposure with approach time. From there, movement continued on foot, using walls, irrigation lines, and terrain where possible. It wasn't stealth in the traditional sense, it was controlled presence, avoiding sudden or aggressive movement. The compound was typical: mud walls, connected structures, limited visibility between buildings. That reduced long-range observation but increased close-range complexity. Adjacent compounds meant any disturbance could spread quickly. Once the final approach began, speed replaced subtlety. Entry was made through an unsecured access point, consistent with the assumption that the target did not expect immediate action during daylight. Inside, the situation developed quickly. Identification took slightly longer than ideal, with individuals moving and reacting unpredictably. One attempted to move toward a rear exit, suggesting awareness of previous raid patterns, but the route was already covered. Another reached for something inside a room that had not yet been cleared, forcing a rapid adjustment. It didn't turn into a firefight, but it came close enough to show how narrow the margin was. The target was secured alive. Materials collected were limited but useful: phones, written notes, small fragments of information. Total time inside remained under 3 minutes, but it wasn't frictionless. There were brief delays, minor misalignments in movement, and signs of activity in nearby structures that could have escalated if timing had slipped. The absence of resistance wasn't luck, it was timing. The operation moved faster than the situation could fully react. Exfiltration confirmed the effect. There was no immediate convergence of fighters, no incoming fire during withdrawal. Not because the area was safe, but because the operation didn't match the expected pattern. Information takes time to move, especially when it contradicts assumptions. By the time the situation was understood, the teams were already leaving. That delay, even if only minutes, made the difference. Back at the base, the result wasn't treated as a breakthrough. One operation doesn't change a campaign. Daylight movement remained high risk, and not every target would allow that approach. But the outcome showed that the Taliban's adaptation to night raids had created a gap. The intelligence recovered was processed through the usual cycle. Most of it was low level, but one contact stood out due to recent daytime activity. That detail supported the initial idea. Parts of the network were operating on a rhythm not fully targeted. Planning for the next mission began within hours. The discussion about timing was shorter this time. The question was no longer whether daylight operations were possible, but where they could be used without unnecessary risk. The objective wasn't to replace night raids, but to break predictability. In a conflict defined by adaptation, even a small shift could force the enemy to adjust again. Helmand didn't change after one operation. The broader situation remained unstable, and the Taliban still controlled the pace in many areas. But the pattern that had been working in their favor was no longer untouched. The initiative shifted slightly, just enough to matter. And in a campaign where momentum decided everything, that was enough to build on. The first daylight operation didn't change Helmand, but it changed how targets were viewed. Until that point, most raids were built around a predictable cycle. Find a target, confirm night presence, hit after dark, process intelligence, repeat. It worked, but the Taliban had adapted just enough to stay ahead. They avoided staying in one place at night, limited communication windows, and used terrain to disappear before raids landed. The SAS approach didn't replace that system. It forced a break in its timing. That was enough to create pressure. Follow-up operations were planned carefully. There was no shift to constant daylight raids, only selective use based on behavior. Targets were chosen not just for value, but for exposure. Who moved during the day, who relied on routine, who stayed visible longer than they should. Intelligence from the first raid pointed to a facilitator linking several low-level contacts across nearby villages. He wasn't a major figure, but he moved frequently during daylight and depended more on familiarity than security. That made him suitable. The plan adjusted accordingly. Vehicles would close distance quickly, reducing time spent exposed. Dismount would happen closer to the objective, trading stealth for speed. It increased risk of detection, but reduced the chance of the target escaping once movement began. The approach started late morning, when activity was normal and nothing stood out. Civilian presence was higher, which meant identification had to be exact. Any hesitation at the wrong moment could escalate the situation. As the convoy entered the area, movement stayed controlled. No sudden changes, no aggressive positioning. From a distance, it was routine. That didn't mean unnoticed. Helmand rarely was, but not every movement triggered reaction. The teams dismounted closer than before and moved on foot immediately. There was no slow approach. Speed mattered more than concealment in the final stretch. The compound showed signs of activity. Movement inside confirmed the target might still be present. Entry was forced without delay. The reaction inside was faster than in the previous operation. One individual reached for a weapon and was stopped before he could bring it into play. Another attempted to move toward an adjoining structure, forcing a quick adjustment to block the exit. The sequence wasn't perfect, but it held together. Rooms were cleared quickly, positions maintained, and control was established before resistance could organize. The target was secured alive. Additional individuals were detained, all connected at different levels to the same network. The material recovered was more useful than before. Multiple phones, written records, and indications of coordination between locations. It wasn't a breakthrough on its own, but it extended the chain. The difference came after extraction. Instead of waiting for the next cycle, the intelligence was processed immediately. Recent calls and contacts were prioritized. One number linked to a location less than an hour away. It wasn't fully confirmed, but it was current. That created a decision point. Act immediately or wait for better information. Waiting reduced risk, but increased the chance of losing the target. Acting meant moving with incomplete data. The decision was made to move. The second operation that day compressed everything: planning, coordination, verification. There was less time to refine details, more reliance on speed. The assumption was that the network would react quickly once the first raid was known. If that was true, the window for a follow-up was already closing. The approach was more direct. Less effort to blend in, more focus on reaching the location fast. As the teams moved in, there were signs the situation had shifted. Movement in nearby areas, small changes that suggested awareness. Whether it was connected to the first raid or not didn't matter. The margin for surprise was smaller. Entry was immediate. This time, resistance appeared. Not organized, not sustained, but present. A short exchange of fire inside the compound, controlled and brief. It lasted seconds, but it changed the tone. The operation required adjustment in real time. Positions tightened, movement accelerated, Control re-established. The primary target wasn't there. That was the cost of acting quickly on partial intelligence. But the location wasn't empty. 2 individuals were detained, both linked to the network. Materials recovered were less clear, more fragmented. At first glance, it looked like a partial miss. Back at the base, the results were analyzed together, not separately. The value wasn't just in who was captured, but in how the network responded. The second location showed signs of rapid movement, suggesting that information had begun to spread. The reaction wasn't coordinated, but it was immediate. That mattered more than the missed target. The pattern became clearer. When pressure was applied during the day, the network reacted faster but less effectively. Movement increased, decisions were rushed, and connections became more visible. Unlike night operations, where targets had already adapted their behavior, daytime pressure forced them into less controlled responses. That shifted the focus. Operations were no longer only about capturing individuals. They were about forcing movement. One raid to trigger relocation, another to catch it. Timing became as important as intelligence. The objective wasn't to eliminate the network in one strike, but to disrupt its rhythm until it became predictable again. Over the next few days, the tempo adjusted. Not dramatically, but enough to matter. Night raids continued, but now they were mixed with selective daylight operations. The pattern became uneven, harder to anticipate. The Taliban adjusted, but this time they were reacting to something less stable. For the teams on the ground, the difference was noticeable. Operations required more flexibility. Plans changed faster. There was less reliance on routine and more focus on timing. It wasn't easier. Daylight increased exposure, and mistakes carried immediate consequences. But it created opportunities that hadn't existed before. The initiative began to shift, not in a way that changed the overall situation overnight, but enough to disrupt the balance. The Taliban were no longer operating entirely on their own terms. They were being forced to respond, and response created openings. In Helmand, that was the first step. And once it started, it didn't stop. By the time the third wave of operations began, Helmand was no longer behaving like a stable battlefield for either side. It had turned into a reaction space. Every action from coalition forces now produced a visible, often messy response from the Taliban network. The initial idea behind daylight raids had been simple: break predictability. But what emerged instead was something more complex. The enemy wasn't just being disrupted, they were starting to overreact. Intelligence flowing into the operations center showed a clear shift. After each daytime strike, movement across the local network increased sharply within hours. Couriers stopped using planned routes. Mid-level facilitators changed locations more frequently, sometimes abandoning compounds entirely after only brief stays. The system that had been built around patience and concealment was starting to lose structure under pressure applied at unusual times. Night operations still worked, but they no longer defined the tempo. Daylight activity had introduced uncertainty into how and when people moved. The SAS approach evolved with that change. They were no longer simply selecting targets based on exposure, but actively looking for chain reactions. One raid was no longer an isolated event. It was a trigger. The goal became to identify who would move after pressure was applied, and then catch that movement in real time. That required faster decisions and tighter coordination between intelligence and ground teams. It also meant accepting that not every strike would hit its primary objective. One of the clearest examples came during a mid-morning operation targeting a logistics figure responsible for moving supplies between rural compounds. The intelligence was partial but consistent enough to justify action. Instead of waiting for a perfect picture, the decision was made to act quickly and observe the reaction. The approach was similar to previous daylight raids: fast movement, minimal exposure, direct entry. But this time, surveillance assets were positioned differently. The focus wasn't only on the target location, but on surrounding movement within the wider area. When the strike went in, the compound itself yielded limited results. The primary target was not present. However, within 20 minutes, intercepts and visual feeds showed multiple individuals in nearby locations shifting positions. One vehicle left a compound it had occupied for days. Another contact, previously inactive, began moving toward a rural route that hadn't been used in weeks. It wasn't chaos, but it wasn't controlled either. It was reaction under pressure. That movement became the real target. A follow-up operation was launched almost immediately. Not because the intelligence was complete, but because the window created by the first strike was still open. This second engagement was faster, less refined, and more dependent on timing than planning. The teams moved before the network could settle. It was during this phase that contact became more unpredictable. Unlike earlier raids, where resistance was either absent or minimal, this time there were signs of coordination forming under pressure. Inside the target area, the situation escalated briefly, not into a prolonged firefight, but into a series of short, sharp exchanges as individuals attempted to move out of containment zones that had been unintentionally created by the rapid sequence of operations. The teams adjusted in real time, tightening control over exits and forcing decisions in seconds rather than minutes. It was not a clean operation, but it remained contained. The target network did not have time to stabilize. What mattered more than the immediate outcome was what came out of the pattern analysis afterward. Intelligence teams began mapping connections between movement after each strike. A clearer structure emerged. Certain individuals were not only avoiding raids, but actively responding to them by relocating others in the network. This meant the system wasn't just reactive, it was interconnected in ways that could be exposed through pressure. The SAS and American analysts began treating each operation less as an endpoint and more as a diagnostic tool. The objective shifted slightly again. Instead of only targeting known facilitators, they started identifying nodes that produced movement when disturbed. These were not always high-value individuals, but they were structurally important. Removing or pressuring them created disproportionate disruption. As this method developed, the tempo of operations increased. Not dramatically, but consistently. Some days saw multiple actions across different areas, each designed to test reaction speed and communication between cells. The Taliban response became more fragmented. In some cases, they overcorrected, abandoning positions too early or moving key individuals unnecessarily. In others, they failed to react in time at all. The pressure was working, but it was not linear. There were still missed opportunities, and not every strike produced useful intelligence. Some operations hit empty locations or low-value contacts. But even those failures contributed to the broader picture. Every reaction, successful or not, revealed something about how the network was adjusting. Within coalition command, there was growing recognition that the fight had shifted away from static targeting. It was now about tempo control. Who could force the other side to move first, and who could exploit that movement faster? The SAS role in this evolution was becoming more visible, not because they were operating alone, but because their approach emphasized disruption over repetition. They were less concerned with perfect execution and more focused on forcing instability. By the end of this phase, the Taliban network in the area was still functional, but it was no longer operating with the same coherence. Movement was faster but less coordinated. Communication existed but was more fragmented. And most importantly, decisions were being made under pressure rather than planning cycles. Helmand had not been stabilized, but it had been thrown off balance. By early 2009, Helmand no longer felt like a battlefield defined by initiative. It felt like a system under stress, constantly adjusting but never fully stabilizing. The Taliban network was still present, still dangerous, still capable of striking coalition forces with IEDs and ambushes. But something fundamental had changed. They were no longer setting the rhythm of the fight. They were reacting to it. The accumulation of daytime pressure had done what no single operation could achieve. It didn't destroy the network. It forced it to reveal itself. Movement that had once been carefully controlled became inconsistent. Couriers changed routes too often. Mid-level facilitators abandoned compounds earlier than necessary. Communication patterns tightened and then fractured under repeated disruption. Every time the coalition applied pressure during daylight hours, the system responded faster, but less coherently. What emerged in intelligence summaries was not collapse, but loss of stability. A network that once absorbed pressure and adapted calmly was now overcorrecting. That overreaction created openings. Some individuals moved too quickly and exposed links that would otherwise remain hidden. Others stopped moving entirely, cutting communication to avoid detection. Both reactions weakened coordination. The SAS approach had become part of a larger operational rhythm by this point. It was no longer about introducing daylight raids as an experiment. It was about using timing as a weapon. Night operations still existed, but they were now interwoven with unpredictable daytime strikes designed to disrupt planning cycles. The effect was cumulative. No single raid defined the shift, but together they created a constant state of uncertainty inside the network. One of the final major operations in this cycle came from a chain reaction that began with a relatively minor daytime strike on a suspected courier hub. The initial target was not significant on its own. Intelligence suggested low-level logistics activity, nothing strategic. But the decision was made to hit it during daylight anyway, not for the value of the target, but to observe the response. The reaction was immediate and more visible than expected. Within an hour, multiple individuals connected to the site began relocating across different sectors of Helmand. Not in a coordinated withdrawal, but in scattered movement that suggested urgency rather than planning. One of those movements intersected with an existing surveillance track tied to a higher-value facilitator. That intersection became the new target. The follow-up operation was executed quickly, with minimal delay between identification and action. There was no time for extended planning. The objective was simple: exploit the movement before it settled. The teams moved under compressed conditions, relying on speed rather than detailed intelligence refinement. What they encountered was a partially prepared environment, individuals aware that something was happening, but not fully organized to respond. The engagement itself was brief. Resistance appeared, but it was fragmented. Some individuals attempted to escape rather than fight. Others reacted too late to make coordinated defense possible. The structure that normally held these locations together under pressure simply didn't form in time. Within minutes, control was established. The most important outcome was not the target captured, but the intelligence recovered. Devices, documents, and communication fragments confirmed what had been suspected for weeks. The network was no longer operating as a unified system. It had split into smaller, faster reacting clusters. Each cluster was trying to survive independently, responding to pressure rather than anticipating it. That fragmentation changed everything. For coalition planners, it meant the network was now more visible, but also less predictable. For the Taliban, it meant survival depended on speed rather than coordination. For SAS and American Special Operations Forces working together, it confirmed that the strategy of disrupting rhythm had achieved its effect. But it also introduced a new reality. Fragmented networks don't stop being dangerous. They become harder to map, not easier. The fight didn't end or slow down. It shifted shape again. By the middle of 2009, the operational tempo began to stabilize. Not because the conflict was over, but because the system had reached a new equilibrium. The Taliban could no longer operate with the same level of coordination they once had. But coalition forces were also dealing with a more chaotic and dispersed threat. The clarity of early targeting cycles had been replaced by a more fluid environment where intelligence had to be interpreted faster and acted on sooner. The SAS presence, along with other coalition special operations units, gradually drew down as rotations ended and priorities shifted. There was no single moment of conclusion, no final operation that marked the end of the phase. Units simply completed their deployments and left, as they always did, without ceremony. What remained behind was not a decisive victory in the traditional sense, but a measurable change in how the conflict had been fought during that period. The Taliban network in Helmand had been pressured, disrupted, and forced into patterns of reaction rather than control. Coalition forces had not eliminated the threat, but they had changed its behavior. And in that kind of war, that was often the only victory available.